I still hear it, the echo of that fateful moment as if etched in searing neon across my soul. My wife contracted an STD after her affair with her boss. Now she's in the hospital. Those words, delivered in hushed tones by a frantic nurse on a cold, sterile phone call, shattered my world. In that instant, every promise, every quiet dream we'd built together collapsed into a maelstrom of betrayal and despair. I was left drowning in a tidal wave of shock, anger, and utter heartbreak, a public, painful reality I never imagined would come to pass. I remember the day with an intensity that makes my hands tremble even now. It began like any other morning in our small, warmly lit home. The early sunlight filtered through our curtains, and for a fleeting moment, everything seemed ordinary. My wife, Sarah, was already up and bustling about our modest kitchen, preparing breakfast, humming softly to herself as she always did. I too carried out my routine, sipping coffee and reading the morning paper. Yet, beneath that veneer of normalcy, I sensed a disquiet I couldn't quite place, a subtle tension in her smile, a hesitance in her eyes that I later learned was the prelude to the storm. It wasn't until later that afternoon, when I returned from a routine business trip, that the truth began to seep into my reality like poison. I had been away for just a couple of days, and while I expected to be greeted by the usual warmth at home, I was met with an eerie silence and an atmosphere heavy with unspoken words. Sarah's phone lay abandoned on the coffee table, its screen flashing a series of urgent notifications. My heart pounded as I picked it up and saw a string of messages and missed calls, from her doctor, from an unknown number, and then a single message that made my blood run cold. Urgent, please come to St. Mary's Hospital immediately. Your wife has been admitted. I raced to the hospital, each minute stretching into an eternity. As I drove through rain-slicked streets under a gray sky, I tried to assemble the pieces of my fractured mind. What could have happened? Why was my wife, my partner of so many years, suddenly in a hospital bed? My thoughts spun in a relentless vortex of dread and disbelief. When I finally arrived, the antiseptic scent of the emergency room hit me hard, and the sterile white lights made everything feel unreal. A nurse met me with a sympathetic yet professional expression and led me to a quiet room. There, I found Sarah lying on a hospital bed, her face pale and her eyes closed as if in restless sleep. The air was thick with worry. I felt an overwhelming surge of emotion, fear for her health, guilt for not having been there, and a gnawing dread of what the doctor might say. Moments later, the doctor entered, his face grave. He explained in measured tones that Sarah had contracted a sexually transmitted infection. My world spun as he detailed how she had recently been treated for severe symptoms and that her condition was more serious than we had ever suspected. The words seemed to echo in my ears: STD, infection, treatment. I stared at the doctor, numb, unable to process the clinical detachment with which he delivered the news. My mind raced back to fragments of conversations, hints I had ignored, late nights on her phone, furtive glances at messages I could not decipher, and the distance that had slowly grown between us. Now, every doubt, every unspoken suspicion, coalesced into a crushing certainty. My wife had been unfaithful, and the consequence of that betrayal was now written on her fragile body. I left the hospital in a haze. The image of Sarah lying helpless on that bed burned into my memory. The ride home was a blur of rain and tears. I felt an unbearable mix of anger and sorrow, anger at the betrayal that had shattered our trust, and sorrow for the woman I once loved, now facing the consequences of her choices. I spent that night in a restless, sleepless state, wrestling with my emotions and questioning everything I thought I knew about our life together. In the days that followed, the harsh reality began to settle in. I confronted Sarah when she finally awoke. In the quiet intimacy of our hospital room, with machines beeping softly in the background, she looked at me with eyes filled with remorse and fear. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The admission of her affair, the painful truth of her contracting an infection from her boss, spilled out in halting, tearful confessions. She told me about the allure of a new life she had imagined, a life of excitement, luxury, and freedom from the mundane routine of our marriage. But that pursuit had come at a devastating cost. Her boss, a man of influence and charm, had seduced her not just with promises but with a facade of power that ultimately proved to be as destructive as it was tempting. Every word she spoke was a dagger to my already wounded heart. I listened, feeling a blend of betrayal and grief so deep it left me hollow. I wanted to scream, to lash out, but I found myself paralyzed by the raw intensity of the moment. In that sterile hospital room, I saw not just the physical toll of her illness, but the deep, emotional scars of a love betrayed. The following days were a blur of hospital visits, consultations with doctors, and quiet nights of painful reflection. I tried to care for her, to support her as she underwent treatment, but the wound between us was raw and unhealed. Each attempt at a gentle touch was met with hesitation, a silent barrier erected by pain and shame. I began to feel increasingly isolated, trapped in a web of our shared failure and the echo of my own inadequacies. As I grappled with the overwhelming sense of loss and betrayal, I turned inward. I found solace in my journal, writing tirelessly about every emotion that surged through me, the anger, the sorrow, the unyielding regret. I wondered if I had ever truly known her, or if the illusions of our marriage had blinded me to the truth. I questioned if the woman I thought I loved had been living a double life, one filled with secrets and silent despair. And I wondered how I would ever rebuild my sense of self when the foundation of trust had been so violently shattered. I reached out to a therapist, desperate for guidance through the tumult. In those sessions I began to unpack the layers of my pain. I learned that betrayal is a wound that takes time to heal, and that forgiveness, if it were ever to come, must be earned slowly through honest self-reflection and accountability. My therapist urged me to confront my feelings head-on, to acknowledge not only the betrayal but also the parts of myself that had allowed our connection to falter. I began to see that the journey to healing would be long and fraught with moments of bitter reflection, but it was a necessary path if I was to reclaim my dignity and perhaps one day find a way to forgive. In the midst of this inner turmoil, I couldn't help but feel a lingering sorrow for what we had lost. The life we had built, a tapestry of shared dreams, quiet moments and genuine affection, had been irrevocably altered by one night of recklessness. I mourned not only the betrayal itself but the future we would never have, a future filled with simple joys that now seemed forever tainted by the specter of infidelity. Yet even as I navigated the dark waters of grief, a part of me began to stir, a faint glimmer of resolve that whispered that this was not the end of my story. I resolved that, regardless of the pain, I would not let this betrayal define me. I would use the harsh lessons of that night as a catalyst for self-discovery, for growth, and for rebuilding a sense of self that was independent of the love I had lost. The path ahead was uncertain, and the journey to healing promised to be long, but I knew that I had to begin. One step, one day, one honest conversation at a time. As I sat alone in the quiet of our now empty home, I made a silent vow. I would not let this moment of humiliation, this crushing betrayal, break me completely. I would learn to forgive, not necessarily to forget but to allow the possibility of renewal. I would rebuild my identity, piece by painful piece, reclaiming the parts of me that had been buried under the weight of regret and shame. My heart, though battered and bruised, still held the capacity to love and to heal, and I was determined to find that strength again. The future remained shrouded in uncertainty. I didn't know if Sarah's journey toward recovery would eventually lead to reconciliation, or if our lives were now destined to diverge forever. But as I wrote these words in my journal, my hand steady despite the lingering tremors of grief, I understood one undeniable truth: I had a choice. I could wallow in the bitterness of betrayal, or I could choose to rise, to learn from this profound loss, and to redefine what it meant to truly live. I chose the latter. Now, as I prepare to face another day, one filled with the quiet challenges of rebuilding trust and rediscovering my own worth, I hold on to the fragile hope that even the deepest wounds can, over time, heal. My journey is far from over, and the scars of that painful night will always be a part of me. But I believe that every ending carries within it the seed of a new beginning, and I am ready to nurture that seed with the lessons of my past and the strength I am rediscovering in the present. I awoke the morning after that humiliating birthday with my heart in knots and the bitter taste of betrayal still fresh on my tongue. The image of that moment, of Victor's cruel words echoing in the silent void of our party, of my wife's infatuated smile as she looked at him, and of the stunned faces that bore witness to my public undoing, refused to leave me. It was as if time had conspired to trap me in that moment of shattering vulnerability. Yet, as the early light crept through the window and I sat alone at my kitchen table, I realized that despite the devastation, I now had a choice: to let this pain define me, or to use it as the raw material for rebuilding who I truly was. 4 weeks after that fateful night, my life dissolved into a blur of sorrow, isolation, and endless self-recrimination. I avoided the familiar places we once cherished. Our living room, once vibrant with shared laughter and whispered dreams, now felt like a mausoleum of lost hope. Every time I passed the mirror, I saw not the man I'd been, but a hollow shell haunted by the memory of those hurtful words: "You'll never be as successful as me." It was a sentence that had been meant to belittle, to crush any flicker of self-belief I had left. And yet, in the quiet despair of those long nights, I began to understand that if I were to reclaim any semblance of dignity, I would have to face my mistakes head-on and chart a new path forward. I began by seeking solace in writing. Every night, after the world had quieted and the hum of the city turned into a distant lullaby, I would sit at my old desk and pour out my emotions into a battered journal. My words came out in a torrent, raw confessions of guilt, the piercing regret for every unthinking remark, and the overwhelming grief of watching my personal life crumble before the eyes of strangers. I wrote about the shock of that birthday, the way the room had fallen deathly silent as Victor's words had cut through the chatter like a jagged shard of glass. I recalled every detail, the glint in his eyes, the twisted smile on his face, the way my wife's expression flickered between delight and apprehension. Through those pages, I slowly began to confront the layers of my own inadequacy and the long-held insecurities that I had buried beneath the surface of our seemingly stable life. At the same time, I knew that I couldn't retreat forever into my sorrow. With the support of a close friend, a kind soul who had listened without judgment, I reached out to a therapist. In the gentle, safe space of our sessions, I learned that betrayal, as painful as it is, can also be a catalyst for transformation. My therapist helped me untangle the complex emotions swirling inside me, the anger at being publicly humiliated, the deep sorrow of losing trust, and the creeping realization that I had allowed my own complacency to contribute to our unraveling. I began to see that while Victor's callous comment had been the spark, the real fire had been smoldering beneath our marriage for far too long. This understanding was not an excuse for what had happened. It was a hard, painful truth that demanded I take responsibility for my part in our shared downfall. Slowly I started to take steps toward rebuilding myself. I reconnected with old passions I had set aside in the wake of our busy, comfortable life. I dusted off my old guitar and, despite my rusty fingers, began to strum the chords of songs that once brought me solace. I took long walks in the early morning when the city was still and the air smelled of promise. With every step, I allowed myself to reflect on what I truly valued: genuine connection, honest work, and the quiet satisfaction of self-improvement. The world outside was moving on, indifferent to my private anguish, and I realized that I, too, must learn to move forward. My work became an unexpected refuge. I threw myself into projects with a focus and determination that I had never known before. I took on new challenges at my job, not to prove anything to anyone but to prove to myself that I was capable of rising above the humiliation. Every successful presentation, every new client acquired, every acknowledgement of my efforts felt like a small victory against the cruelty of that birthday night. I began setting goals, ambitious yet attainable, that would eventually redefine what success meant to me. I celebrated the small wins: a well-received email from a colleague, a quiet nod from a supervisor, the steady progress on a project I had poured my soul into. These victories, though modest, gradually began to stitch together a new sense of self-worth that I had thought was lost forever. At work, as I focused on my professional goals, I noticed subtle shifts in how people treated me. Colleagues who had once offered pitying glances now saw me as someone who had weathered a storm. I was invited to lead projects, my opinions were sought, and slowly I began to rebuild a reputation not as a broken man but as someone who had risen, resilient and determined. My career, once overshadowed by personal turmoil, became the foundation upon which I started to reconstruct my life. Every meeting, every decision, was a step on the road to rediscovering my identity, one that was defined not by past betrayals but by my unwavering determination to succeed. Yet even as I began to find solace in my work and in my renewed passions, the personal wounds remained. I missed the intimacy and the warmth that I once shared with my wife, and the public humiliation still lurked in the corners of my memory, a constant reminder of the cost of careless words. I attempted to reach out to her, to understand if there was a path to forgiveness, but each time she recoiled, unable to bridge the chasm that had grown between us. The physical space between us became a metaphor for the emotional distance, a distance measured in hurt, betrayal, and shattered trust. I learned that some wounds run too deep to heal quickly, and that forgiveness, if it ever came, would be a slow, uncertain process. One crisp spring day, as I sat on a park bench watching the world come alive with color and possibility, I had an epiphany. I realized that the journey to redemption is not about erasing the past. It's about accepting it, learning from it, and using it to build a stronger, wiser future. I began to see that every painful moment, every hurtful word, was a lesson. A harsh but honest lesson about the fragility of trust and the importance of communication. I decided then that I would not let that night, or the echo of those degrading words, dictate the rest of my life. Instead, I would channel the pain into a commitment to live authentically, to embrace my vulnerabilities, and to rebuild my life one deliberate step at a time. In the months that followed, I immersed myself in self-improvement. I attended workshops on emotional intelligence and communication, learning to articulate my feelings with clarity and to listen to others with compassion. I joined a support group for individuals who had experienced public humiliation and betrayal, and through the shared stories of others, I began to feel less isolated. The realization that I was not alone, that many had walked similar paths and emerged stronger, provided me with a quiet, determined hope. We exchanged our stories over cups of tea and long walks, our voices soft and understanding as we each recounted our journeys of loss and recovery. In those moments, I felt the heavy burden on my heart lighten, replaced by a solidarity that affirmed the human capacity to heal. My therapist helped me set small, daily goals. I started by making a promise to myself to get out of bed every morning with a sense of purpose, to face each new day as an opportunity to rebuild. I began writing again, not just in my journal but in the form of a blog where I could share my raw, unfiltered journey with others who might be struggling. The process of writing became both a catharsis and a call to action. Every blog post was a step toward reclaiming my voice, a voice that had been silenced by shame and fear. The response was unexpected. Strangers reached out with messages of encouragement, sharing their own stories of heartbreak and resilience. It was in that exchange of vulnerability that I found a spark of empowerment, a validation that even the deepest wounds can, over time, lead to growth and transformation. Meanwhile, at work, my dedication began to pay off in tangible ways. I was entrusted with larger projects, and I led my team with a quiet confidence that was rooted in both experience and newfound wisdom. I learned that success isn't about erasing your past mistakes, but about building on them, learning from each misstep, and forging ahead with integrity. I celebrated each milestone, each contract signed, each new client acquired, every time I saw the respectful nods of my colleagues. These achievements weren't just markers of professional success. They were proof that I was rebuilding my identity, that I was more than the sum of one humiliating moment. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings and personal breakthroughs, I sat down with my wife in our sparsely decorated living room, a space that once overflowed with shared memories and love, but now was a quiet testament to our broken trust. There were no dramatic declarations, no sudden reconciliations, only a tentative, fragile conversation. I looked into her eyes, which were filled with sorrow and regret, and I realized that while we might never return to the intimacy we once knew, there was the possibility of a respectful, honest connection. "I'm not asking for everything to go back to how it was," I said softly. "But maybe we can start by being honest with each other, about our pain, our fears, and what we need to heal." For a long, heavy moment, she said nothing, and I could see the struggle within her, between the desire to cling to what was familiar and the fear of confronting a truth that was too painful. Finally, she nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek, and we agreed to try couples counseling. The counseling sessions were raw and unfiltered. We bared our souls, our failures, our unmet needs, our quiet resentments. There were days when the sessions left us both drained, as if the weight of our shared pain was too much to bear. Yet, slowly, the dialogue began to open up pathways that had been long sealed by fear and hurt. I learned to express not just my anger but also my longing for the woman I once loved, and she learned to acknowledge the ways in which our life together had lost its spark. We began to see that our issues were not insurmountable barriers, but challenges to be met with honesty, patience, and ultimately forgiveness. In time, as the seasons changed and the harshness of winter gave way to the tentative blooms of spring, our relationship began to show signs of recovery. It wasn't a fairy tale, there were still moments of tension and pain. But gradually we found a rhythm, a delicate dance of rebuilding trust and redefining our connection. I no longer felt the crushing weight of public humiliation every time I looked at her, and she no longer recoiled at my touch with the same guarded fear. We were learning, painfully and slowly, to be present with each other, to honor both the good memories and the lessons of our past. Outside the confines of our personal struggle, I continued to thrive in my professional life. The company I had built, nurtured through countless hours of hard work and resilience, became a source of strength and purpose. I was invited to speak at industry events about the importance of overcoming personal challenges and building a career rooted in authenticity and perseverance. In sharing my journey, I discovered that my story resonated with many people who had faced their own betrayals, who had been publicly humiliated, and who were now finding the courage to rebuild. Every message of encouragement, every note of solidarity, reinforced the truth that our scars need not be symbols of defeat but can serve as badges of honor on the long road to redemption. There were nights when I would sit by the window, gazing at the city lights and reflect on how far I had come. I thought about the man I once was, a man crippled by the weight of betrayal and public shame, and the person I had become through the slow, arduous process of healing. I had learned that forgiveness, both for myself and for those who had hurt me, was not an act of weakness, but a powerful step toward reclaiming my future. I knew that there would always be moments of pain, echoes of that fateful birthday that might resurface in quiet, unexpected ways. But I also knew that I now possessed an inner strength that no one could take away, a strength forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by the gentle, persistent passage of time. Today, as I write these final lines, I feel a sense of cautious optimism. My wife and I are not the same people we once were. We have both been irrevocably changed by the wounds we carry, but we have also grown from them. Our relationship remains fragile, a delicate tapestry woven from honesty, therapy, and the relentless effort to forgive. We still have many challenges ahead, a long road to rebuild complete trust and intimacy, but each day we choose to meet those challenges together, we take one more step toward a future that, while uncertain, is filled with the possibility of healing and renewal. I have learned that life's greatest triumphs often arise from our deepest failures. What began as a moment of public humiliation, a reckless joke that shattered trust and left me feeling exposed, has become the catalyst for a profound journey of self-discovery and transformation. I now understand that every scar, every painful memory, is a testament to our ability to rise above adversity. I have reclaimed my identity not in spite of my mistakes, but because of them. My journey is far from over, but I choose to see each day as an opportunity to grow, to love, and to live authentically. As the night deepens and I close my journal, I carry with me the quiet promise that tomorrow is another chance. A chance to continue rebuilding, to mend what has been broken, and to step forward with the unyielding resolve that I am worthy of redemption. I am a work in progress, a man who has weathered public shame and personal betrayal, and I stand ready to face the future with a heart that, though scarred, beats with hope and resilience.